The clock on the wall of the glass boardroom read 4:12 p.m., bright red digital numbers that felt entirely too aggressive for a Thursday afternoon. I sat near the middle of the long mahogany table, nursing a lukewarm coffee, waiting for the budget alignment meeting to end. For 19 years, I had sat in this exact room, watching Apex Solutions grow from a struggling startup held together by duct tape and prayers into a logistics powerhouse handling millions of transactions a day. My name is Richard Foster. I am 55 years old, and as the director of operations, I was the duct tape. I was the guy who knew the systems inside and out, the guy who patched the code at 2 a.m. when a server cluster decided to fail, the guy who made sure our data complied with the suffocating regulations of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, specifically Section 404, without breaking a sweat. But as Elaine Vance, our chief financial officer, stood at the head of the table, adjusting her designer glasses, I felt a shift in the air. Due to recent budget realignments and our strategic shift toward dynamic scaling, Elaine began, her voice smooth and rehearsed. Bonuses this quarter will be distributed exclusively across the forward-facing leadership team. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room. With one exception, we appreciate everyone's contributions, but not all roles fall within the new incentive structure. She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. I looked down at the printed packet in front of me. Page 1 summarized my performance metrics. Everything was green. System uptime at 99%. Compliance audit passed without a single infraction. Efficiency up by 14%. But on page 2, where the bonus figure should have been printed in bold black ink, there was nothing. A blank space. Not a zero, just an empty void. To my left sat Julian Pierce. Julian was 38. Possessed a freshly minted MBA from a school he loved to casually mention, and wore suits that cost more than my first car. He had been hired 6 months ago as the vice president of strategic initiatives. What did that mean? In practice, it meant he sat in meetings, repackaged my operational data into sleek PowerPoint slides, and presented them to the board as his own visionary ideas. He didn't know the difference between a SQL database and a spreadsheet, but he knew how to use words like synergy, paradigm shift, and holistic optimization. As Elaine announced the bonus structure, Julian offered a sympathetic, tight-lipped smile in my direction. The kind of smile a politician gives a pothole. "We will be finalizing the distributions by Friday," Elaine said, closing her leather-bound folder with a soft thud. "If there are any questions, feel free to reach out to HR." Silence blanketed the room. Across the table, the VP of sales cleared his throat, looked at me for a split second, and then studied his phone. In corporate America, silence isn't just golden, it's agreement. The meeting adjourned. Chairs scraped against the carpet. People filed out quickly, avoiding eye contact. I remained seated for a moment, tracing the edge of the blank space on my paper. A decision like this wasn't made on a whim. This was calculated. Elaine and Julian had successfully convinced the board that operations was merely a background utility, a self-sustaining machine that required no strategic investment. They had erased 19 years of my late nights, weekend fire drills, and undocumented compliance patches in exactly 12 seconds. I stood up, folded the paper, and walked out of the glass boardroom. I wasn't furious. Anger is a hot, loud emotion. What I felt was a cold, quiet clarity. The kind of clarity you get when a fog finally lifts and you see the cliff edge 2 inches from your boots. For nearly 2 decades, I had treated Apex Solutions like it was mine. When the automated SOX 404 compliance logs flagged anomalies, which they did constantly because the legacy code was a mess, I manually verified the data, patched the routing logic, and pushed it through so the auditors wouldn't breathe down our necks. It was invisible work. Nobody in the C-suite knew I did it because I never complained. I just kept the machine humming. I built the structure that allowed guys like Julian to stand on stage and take the applause. I had always assumed that my silent competence would be rewarded with loyalty and fair compensation. But as I walked back to my desk, the reality hit me. They didn't see my work as valuable because they couldn't see it at all. Julian had positioned himself as the architect of our success, framing my operational safeguards as standard, automated background processes. The bonus exclusion wasn't an oversight. It was a message. I was a cost center, an aging utility that they could squeeze for margin to pad their own payouts. I sat down at my desk and looked at my monitor. The daily compliance scripts were running in the background. A red error flagged on the screen, data misalignment in transit node 4. Typically, I would write a quick script, manually align the data, and document the fix. It was a small breach, but under Sarbanes-Oxley 404, internal controls over financial reporting had to be ironclad. If the data didn't align, the system couldn't guarantee the integrity of the financial statements. I hovered my mouse over the terminal. I thought about the glass boardroom. I thought about the blank space on page 2. I thought about Julian's smirk and Elaine's rehearsed corporate jargon. I closed the terminal without typing a single line of code. If they believed operations ran itself, who was I to argue? If I wasn't part of the strategic incentive structure, then I shouldn't be making strategic, undocumented interventions. It was time to start acting my wage. I logged the error in the official ticketing system, marked it as a low-priority operational anomaly, and assigned it to the general IT queue. Then, I packed my bag, turned off my monitor, and went home at exactly 5 p.m. For the first time in 19 years, I didn't take my laptop with me. The machine was on its own. The next morning, the office felt exactly the same. The coffee machine still hissed, the fluorescent lights still hummed, and Julian Pierce still walked around like he owned the building. But beneath the surface, the machine was beginning to grind. I arrived at 8:45 a.m., poured a cup of coffee, and sat at my desk. Usually, by this time, I would have already resolved a dozen micro-failures, smoothed out the data pipelines, and ensured the overnight processing batches were clean. Instead, I simply checked my emails and reviewed the official ticketing queue. The error from the previous afternoon, the data misalignment in transit node 4, was still sitting in the general IT queue. The junior techs had looked at it, couldn't figure out the legacy routing logic, and marked it as pending investigation. Because I hadn't stepped in to apply the manual patch, the minor error had begun to cascade. Overnight, the misalignment caused a ripple effect in the automated reporting system. It wasn't a catastrophic failure, just a slight delay. A 12-minute lag in processing client logistics manifests. By 10:30 a.m., I received a message from Julian. "Hey, Richard. Seeing some minor latency in the client dashboards. Can you jump in and smooth it out? Need to keep our metrics pristine for the board update next week." I stared at the message. In the past, I would have replied with "on it," dived into the command line, and spent an hour untangling the mess. But Julian's words from a previous strategy meeting echoed in my head. We need to rely on the automated infrastructure and stop getting bogged down in the operational weeds. I typed my reply carefully. I've reviewed the dashboard latency. The issue is documented in ticket TST 492E8. It's currently in the IT queue following standard protocol. I'm focusing on the scheduled infrastructure review this morning. A few minutes passed. Julian didn't reply. He couldn't push back because I was doing exactly what my job description dictated. I was following the protocols he and Elaine had implemented to streamline operations. The problem was, their streamlined protocols only existed on paper. In reality, the company survived on my willingness to break protocol and fix things behind the scenes. By Wednesday, the 12-minute lag had grown into a 45-minute delay. The system was struggling to reconcile the misaligned data batches. Clients were starting to notice. Several account managers emailed Julian asking why the tracking dashboards were freezing. During the Wednesday afternoon sync, Julian tried to address the issue with his usual confident flair. "We are experiencing some temporary friction as we transition our data nodes," Julian told the room, leaning back in his expensive chair. "It's a natural byproduct of our aggressive scaling strategy. The system is recalibrating." I sat quietly taking notes. It wasn't recalibrating, it was choking, and because Julian didn't understand the architecture, he had no idea how close we were to failing the daily SOX 404 compliance check. Under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, any failure in the internal controls reporting system had to be flagged, audited, and explained. I had spent years masking the system's deficiencies to keep us compliant. Now the system was naked. After the meeting, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I stepped out into the hallway and looked at the screen. It was a text from Martin Ellis. Martin was a former senior developer at Apex who had left 3 years ago when he realized the company valued presentation over substance. He was now the chief technology officer at Nexus Global, our primary competitor. "Hey, Richard," the message read. "Heard through the grapevine that Apex is shaking up the leadership incentives. You finally ready to stop carrying that place on your back? Let's grab lunch." I read the message twice. For 19 years, I had ignored recruiters, deleted LinkedIn requests, and politely declined offers. I was loyal. I believed that if I built a strong foundation, the house would take care of me. But the house had just locked me out of the master bedroom. I texted Martin back. Friday at noon, the steakhouse on 5th. Over the next 2 days, the friction at Apex Solutions amplified. The minor delays began affecting the financial reporting batches. The automated SOX 404 compliance monitor triggered a level 1 warning. It was an internal alert, but if it wasn't resolved by the end of the month, it would escalate to an external audit risk. Elaine Vance called an emergency meeting. "Why are we seeing compliance warnings on the internal dashboard?" Elaine asked, her voice tight and devoid of its usual smooth corporate cadence. "We haven't had a compliance flag in 4 years. It's an anomaly in the reporting software," Julian interjected smoothly, though he looked a little pale. "We've assigned the IT team to patch the interface. It's nothing to worry about, just a visual bug." I almost laughed out loud. It wasn't a visual bug. The system was failing to reconcile the financial ledgers because the data nodes were corrupted. I knew exactly how to fix it. It would take me perhaps 3 hours of deep coding and database realignment. But I sat there, hands folded on the table, and said nothing. I was acting my wage. I was staying out of the strategic weeds. "Richard," Elaine turned to me, her eyes narrowing. "You oversee the operational flow. Why isn't this resolved?" I met her gaze evenly. "The system is functioning according to the parameters set during the last budget alignment," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "The manual override protocols were deprecated last quarter to reduce operational overhead, per Julian's strategic initiative. IT is following the new standard operating procedures." Elaine looked at Julian. Julian swallowed hard. They had ordered the removal of manual overrides to save money on senior operational staff, assuming the system was fully automated. They didn't realize I was the automation. As the meeting wrapped up, the atmosphere was tense. The realization was slowly dawning on them that the machine didn't run on magic. It ran on the invisible labor they had just decided not to pay for. I walked back to my desk, feeling lighter than I had in years. The invisible chains of loyalty had snapped. Friday couldn't come fast enough. By Friday morning, the situation at Apex Solutions had shifted from minor friction to noticeable panic. The Level 1 compliance warning had escalated to a Level 2 alert. The financial data ledgers were completely out of sync, and the system was automatically rejecting the end-of-week settlement batches. In the hallway, the usual confident strides of the executive team had turned into hurried, anxious pacing. Julian Pierce's pristine suit suddenly looked a little rumpled. At 11 a.m., Julian appeared at my desk. He didn't have his usual smug smile. He looked tired. "Richard, we need to talk," he said, pulling up a chair without asking. "This compliance flag is starting to cause real issues. Elaine is breathing down my neck. I need you to go into the back end and force the data alignment. Just do whatever it is you usually do to keep the system green." I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands. "Julian, forcing a data alignment without running the proper reconciliation scripts violates the new automated protocols you implemented. If I manually override the system, it voids the audit trail. Under SOX 404, that's a serious violation. I don't care about the protocols right now," Julian hissed, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "We need the system green before the quarterly review on Monday. Just fix it, Richard. You're the operations guy." "I am the director of operations," I corrected calmly. "And according to the strategic realignment presented last week, my role is strictly administrative oversight. Manual system intervention is outside my current operational scope." Julian stared at me, his jaw clenching. He realized I was throwing his exact corporate jargon right back in his face. "Are you doing this on purpose?" he demanded. "Because of the bonus?" "I'm executing the exact parameters defined by leadership," I said. "If you'd like me to step outside those parameters, I'll need a formal, written request from Elaine authorizing the override and accepting full liability for the compliance breach." Julian stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He didn't say another word. He knew Elaine would never sign a document accepting liability for a SOX 404 violation. They were trapped in the very system they had built. I watched him walk away, checking my watch. It was 11:45. Time for lunch. I met Martin Ellis at the steakhouse on 5th. Martin looked good, relaxed, sharp, and genuinely happy. We ordered drinks and caught up for a few minutes before he cut right to the chase. "I'll be honest, Richard," Martin said, leaning across the table. "Nexus Global is expanding aggressively. We have the capital, we have the clients, but our operational infrastructure is struggling to keep up. We need someone who actually understands how to build and maintain a scalable logistics architecture. We need you." He slid a manila folder across the table. I opened it. Inside was a formal offer letter. The title was Executive Vice President of Global Operations. I looked at the compensation package. The base salary alone was double what I was making at Apex. With the signing bonus and guaranteed equity, the total compensation was nearly triple. "We don't do discretionary leadership bonuses," Martin added, taking a sip of his drink. "We pay people what they're worth, and we give them the authority to actually do their jobs. No MBA middle managers taking credit for your late-night patches." I stared at the numbers. It wasn't just the money. It was the respect. It was the clear, undeniable acknowledgement of the value I brought to the table. For 19 years, I had begged Apex to see my worth. Nexus had seen it from the outside and quantified it on paper. "I'll need 2 weeks to wrap things up," I said, closing the folder. Martin smiled. "Take your time. We're ready when you are." I walked back into the Apex Solutions office at 1:30 p.m. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. The IT team had attempted a hot fix on the database, which had only worsened the misalignment. The system was now locking down client portals to prevent corrupted data from being exported. It was a full-blown operational crisis. I sat at my desk, drafted my resignation letter, and printed it out. No dramatic language. No emotional grievances. Just a clear professional notification of my departure. I put the letter in a plain envelope and walked down the hall to the executive suite. Elaine and Julian were in Elaine's office. The door was closed, but I could hear their raised voices. I knocked twice and walked in. They both stopped talking and looked at me. Julian looked frantic. Elaine looked furious. "Richard, what is it?" Elaine snapped. "We are dealing with a critical system failure. If you don't have a solution, get out." I didn't say a word. I walked over to her desk, placed the envelope perfectly in the center, and stepped back. Elaine frowned. She picked up the envelope, sliced it open with a silver letter opener, and read the single page. I watched the color completely drain from her face. Her perfectly maintained corporate facade cracked. "You're resigning?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Now, Julian's head snapped toward her. "What? He can't resign. The system is crashing." Elaine looked up at me, her eyes wide with sudden, terrifying realization. "Richard, you can't leave. You've been here 19 years. You know this architecture better than anyone. We can discuss your compensation. We can revisit the bonus structure." "The bonus structure was finalized last Thursday," I replied calmly. "At 4:12 p.m. I'm simply aligning my career trajectory with the company's new strategic direction." "You are abandoning this company during a crisis," Julian yelled, stepping forward. "This is sabotage. The system is running exactly as designed by your strategic initiatives, Julian," I said, turning to him. "If the design is flawed, that's a leadership issue. I will serve my standard 2-week notice period and assist with administrative handovers. But I will not be performing manual overrides on a compromised system." I turned and walked out of the office. Behind me, the silence was deafening. The panic had finally set in. They had erased my 19 years of loyalty in seconds, thinking I was just a fixture they could ignore. Now, they were about to learn exactly how much weight that fixture had been holding up. The 2 weeks that followed were a masterclass in corporate meltdown. I served my notice period, strictly adhering to the employee handbook. I arrived at 9 a.m. and left at 5 p.m. I documented my administrative workflows, organized my files, and attended the mandated transition meetings. I did absolutely nothing else. I didn't touch the servers. I didn't debug the code. I didn't write a single line of a manual patch. Without my daily, Undocumented interventions, the Apex Solutions infrastructure began to crumble in plain sight. The Level 2 compliance alert upgraded to a Level 3 critical warning. The automated SOX 404 monitoring system, stripped of the manual band-aids I used to apply, started generating massive error logs. The financial data was fundamentally out of sync with the operational data. In the eyes of the system, millions of dollars in transactions were simply floating in the void, unverified and unreconciled. Clients began to scream. Logistics tracking was delayed by up to 48 hours. Payments were bottlenecked. The pristine dashboards Julian loved to show off were displaying glaring red errors. The board of directors demanded an emergency audit, pulling in external compliance officers to investigate the sudden system failures. Julian Pierce spent the 2 weeks in a state of hyperventilating panic. He tried to hire external consultants to fix the system, but the legacy architecture was a tangled mess of code that only I fully understood. The consultants looked at the routing logic, looked at the compliance errors, and quietly advised Julian that untangling the mess would take months. Elaine Vance tried a different tactic. She tried to threaten me. During a transition meeting in my second week, she slid a printed document across the table. It was a formal warning letter accusing me of dereliction of duty. If you do not immediately resolve the database misalignment, we will be forced to terminate you for cause and pursue legal action for damages, Elaine said, her voice shaking with barely suppressed rage. I didn't even pick up the paper. I pulled out my own folder and slid a stack of printed emails across the desk. Elaine, these are the operational risk assessments I sent to you and Julian over the past 6 months. Every single email details the systemic flaws in the legacy architecture. Every single email requests budget allocation for a proper system overhaul. And every single email was denied by you, citing budget constraints and dynamic scaling initiatives. Elaine stared at the emails. Her signature was at the bottom of the rejection replies. I have spent the last 5 years manually overriding these flaws to keep the company compliant. I continued, my voice calm and measured. When you removed me from the bonus pool and redefined my role as strictly administrative, I stopped performing unauthorized, undocumented system modifications. I am acting in full compliance with your strategic directives. You cannot sue me for doing exactly what you told me to do. Elaine slumped back in her chair. The threat of legal action was empty, and she knew it. The documentation was bulletproof. I had warned them. They had ignored the warnings to pad their own bonuses. They had built their success on a foundation of my invisible labor, and when they stopped paying for it, the foundation collapsed. On my final Friday, the atmosphere in the office was funereal. The external auditors had officially flagged Apex Solutions for severe SOX 404 violations. The board was furious. Client contracts were being suspended under void ab initio clauses due to the company's inability to guarantee data integrity. At 4:45 p.m., I packed the last of my personal items into a small cardboard box. No one came to say goodbye. There were no cake or awkward speeches. Julian was locked in his office on a conference call with the board, and Elaine had reportedly left the building early, citing a migraine. I stood at my desk, looking out over the bullpen. For 19 years, this had been my life. I had sacrificed evenings, weekends, and holidays for this company. I had believed in the mission. I had believed that hard work spoke for itself. But hard work only speaks if the people listening actually understand the language. I picked up my box, walked out the front doors, and didn't look back. The crisp afternoon air felt incredible. I wasn't just leaving a job. I was leaving behind a mindset that told me I had to bleed for a company that wouldn't even offer me a bandage. On Monday morning, I started my new role at Nexus Global. I walked into a bright, modern office and was immediately introduced to the engineering team. Martin Ellis had set up a welcome breakfast. When I sat down at my new desk, there was a clear, defined roadmap of my responsibilities, a robust operational budget, and a team that actually respected my expertise. The compensation package was everything Martin had promised, but the peace of mind was priceless. I was no longer the invisible duct tape holding a broken machine together. I was the architect building a new one, and I was finally being paid exactly what I was worth. 6 months later, I sat in my corner office at Nexus Global, sipping a hot coffee and reviewing the flawless deployment of our new logistics framework. The system was robust, scalable, and completely automated. No manual overrides required. I closed the dashboard, feeling a deep sense of professional satisfaction. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was a news alert from an industry publication. The headline read, Apex Solutions hit with record SEC fines. C-suite executives ousted amidst compliance scandal. I leaned back in my chair and tapped the article. The fallout had been catastrophic, even worse than I had anticipated. The external audit triggered by the SOX 404 violations had blown the lid off Apex's internal operations. The auditors discovered that the company's financial reporting had been entirely dependent on undocumented manual data manipulation. The very manipulation I had stopped performing the day they denied my bonus. When the board of directors investigated how the system had been allowed to deteriorate so severely, they found the paper trail. They found the risk assessments I had sent. They found the budget requests I had submitted for system overhauls. And crucially, they found that Elaine Vance and Julian Pierce had intentionally denied those requests, slashing the operational budget to artificially inflate the company's short-term profitability metrics. By suppressing the operational costs and reallocating the funds to the executive bonus pool, Elaine and Julian had directly lined their own pockets while exposing the company to massive regulatory risk. The board didn't just fire them. They filed a formal lawsuit against both executives for breach of fiduciary duty. The legal doctrine was clear. They had a legal obligation to act in the best interests of the company and its shareholders. Instead, they had acted in their own self-interest, causing millions of dollars in damages and regulatory fines. Julian Pierce, the golden boy with the MBA, was stripped of his severance and publicly disgraced. His attempt to build a career on the back of someone else's invisible labor had ended the moment the laborer walked away. Elaine Vance faced severe legal penalties and was permanently barred from serving as a financial officer for any publicly traded company. They had tried to erase my 19 years of service in seconds, and in the end, they had erased their own careers. Apex Solutions survived, but barely. They lost several major clients, their stock price plummeted, and they were forced to hire a massive team of external contractors at an exorbitant rate just to patch the legacy systems I used to manage for a fraction of the cost. They learned the hard way that operations isn't a background utility. It's the central nervous system of the company. I finished reading the article and closed the tab. I felt a fleeting moment of vindication, but honestly, it was entirely eclipsed by the contentment of my current life. I wasn't angry anymore. The quiet clarity I had felt in that glass boardroom had settled into a profound peace. At Nexus Global, I was valued. My expertise was sought after, not exploited. I left work at 5 p.m. every day, unburdened by the constant anxiety of failing servers and compliance audits. I took weekends off. I actually used my vacation days. The triple compensation was fantastic. It allowed me to fast-track my retirement planning and breathe easy financially, but the true reward was the respect. I looked out the window at the bustling city below. Corporate loyalty is a dangerous illusion. It's a one-way street paved with uncompensated overtime and invisible sacrifices. You can pour your blood, sweat, and tears into a company, but the moment the spreadsheets dictate that you are a liability, they will cut you without a second thought. I had given Apex Solutions 19 years of my life. I had built their foundation, patched their flaws, and protected them from their own incompetence. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed that because my work was invisible, I was powerless. They assumed that because I was quiet, I would accept whatever scraps they threw my way. They were wrong. I picked up my mug and took a sip of coffee. The system at Nexus was running perfectly. The dashboards were a brilliant, uninterrupted green. I smiled, turned back to my monitor, and got to work. I had finally learned the most important lesson of my career. Your true value isn't determined by a boardroom vote. It's determined by what happens when you decide to walk away. And I had walked away, leaving them to their own ruin, winning the ultimate victory in absolute silence.